let's bring on our presenter. Ryan, take it away.
So this is the map for this talk. And be forewarned, I did the dumb thing when preparing for this talk and just jumped down whatever rabbit hole I came across because I find this stuff really interesting. This might end up feeling like 2.5 talks stitched together. I'm gonna try to avoid it, but if it does, I'm sorry. I'm gonna try to remember to slow down and give chances for questions throughout to try and mitigate some of that. And I'm gonna cover some of the big events in the history of ransomware. I'm also going to discuss how the attacker's business model can actually inform our decision-making as defenders. I'm going to cover some of the basics we should be doing to protect ourselves as well. And everyone starts their ransomware talks with good old Chilipop here. And who am I to buck the trend? This is the guy to thank for all of your ransomware woes, and as a consequence of this very talk, it's only sort of true. But he's got a weird story and it's related, so I'm going to tell some of it. This unusual guy lived an odd life. He got his PhD from Harvard. He wrote a book. He founded a butterfly conservatory. And he sent thousands of these floppies all around the world. The software would run a questionnaire that claimed to predict the user's risk of getting HIV. It would also overwrite autoexec.bat and start a counter when it first ran. After the system booted a number of times, it would run the first crypto ransomware payload known. It did a bunch of other interesting stuff, but we're time constrained. These are the big ones, really. Some folks at the time did a pretty good write-up, and Sirius has an archive. You can find it at the URL there in the tiny text box that you may not be able to read. Slides will be available after the talk, so you can go dig that up, or you can just email me and I'll point you at the relevant information. And this is the ransom message. Now it actually tried to print out an invoice for you on your printer. And that's what the first paragraph is talking about there. For some reason, that seems really ballsy to me. Imagine you settle into your office and boot up DOS on your IBM microcomputer or compatible, and you get this message where while your annoyingly loud 80s printer starts chugging away to print you an invoice to send off somewhere in Panama with a money order to some company that you never heard of called PC Cyborg Corporation. And you never even heard of anything like this happening either, because it's 1989. So it's kind of funny, but all this was happening shortly before Manuel Noriega declared war on the US and Operation Just Cause happened. I found articles from back then speculating that this malware was related to those events because of the PO box and the connection to Panama. So it turns out that nation state FUD about malware is about as old as I am. So Dr. Pomp had a business model here. He spent a whole lot of money and time on something that, if we're honest, probably wouldn't ever pay off, but he probably thought it would. PC Cyborg Corporation was actually a real corporation that was registered in April of 1989 in Panama City. And so he spent money setting that up. He probably paid thousands of dollars on the floppies and postage for them. Apparently, he rented out the subscription list for PC Business World in order to get addresses. So he claimed that he was going to be sending their subscribers information. So he paid for that. So there was a decent amount of money that he sunk into this scheme. And some people did get infected, but since it only encrypted the file names and not the file contents, it was readily worked around once it was reverse engineered. And on top of that, it used a symmetric cipher, which meant that the key was in the software. Obviously, this was extracted out and used to reverse the damage eventually. So he almost certainly lost a ton of money on this. And he got caught and deported to the UK to stand trial for it. So even if his motives were as pure as he claimed at trial, he claimed that all of this effort was to support AIDS research. He probably would have been better off just donating the money that he spent on the scheme. That's if he was actually trying to support AIDS research. Regardless, this was just a bad business model. He shouldn't have expected anybody to, enough people to pay him to recoup his losses. And a few years later, some researchers published a paper that really outlines what we think of as ransomware now. The AIDS Trojan is actually one of the examples that they use in that paper. It describes the necessary characteristics of malware, which would be effective at making the malware a dependency for use of the infected machine. Call it a high survivability virus in that it forces the target to let them survive on the host instead of getting rid of it. So for example, if you get rid of the malware, you can't recover your data. That sounds kind of familiar, right? If you haven't read this, actually, it's really interesting to see this stuff written up in 1996. And this is really the core of what ransomware authors are trying to accomplish. If you make yourself a dependency for someone to use an asset that's important enough to them, then you get to dictate the conditions for using that asset. You can start to say things like, give me money or you can't have it back, or give me money or I'll do a bad thing to you, or give me money. Get the idea. Ransomware doesn't have to hit the mark perfectly to do that though. It wasn't until about 10 years after that paper that I mentioned was published that ransomware started to really adopt asymmetric cryptography, for example. And a lot of it still didn't bother with cryptography at all. Since it didn't cost much to distribute it over the internet, it became worthwhile without a high success rate. In another life, I worked in computer repair shops. This is something we call the FBI virus. In those shops, we saw this pretty often. There were flaws in these, and you could really often bypass the malware. And tools to clean this up usually got developed pretty quickly once a new version was seen in the wild. So we could usually get around this. I actually wouldn't be too surprised if the authors of this made computer repair shops more money than they did themselves on it. Then again, it's not like it cost them an arm and a leg to do it, so it's probably still worth it for them to do it. And then came the actually scary stuff. So this is CryptoLocker. It's the first time that I can remember where if we saw it, we knew that we probably couldn't do anything about it to get the user's data. Coincidentally, that's about the same time I got out of the computer repair business. CryptoLocker uses a 2048-bit RSA key. It was distributed by the Zeus botnet, along with some other ways. I think the Zeus botnet was the most common way that it was distributed. I could be wrong about that. Don't quote me. And it used cryptocurrency for payments. That was one of the big new things with this one. So they're solving problems that get in the way of their profitability, right? People aren't paying because repair shops can fix the problem for them instead. Well, use asymmetric crypto, so the decryption key isn't packaged with the malware. It's really, really hard to work around and pull a key out that you can use to decrypt the files that have been encrypted. Financial institutions are getting wise to abuse of their money transfer mechanisms, and law enforcement is tracking those, the movement of money through those mechanisms. We'll use a decentralized payment system that you can easily generate new addresses for. So they're optimizing for their own profitability. This is one of my favorite illustrations of something in the InfoSec world making its way into public consciousness. This is Google search interest for the term ransomware. And does anybody have an idea of what that peak around 2017 is? Just type it into the Q&A or the chat.
We have one.
Cyber insurance?
Yeah.
No. There we go. WannaCry. Yeah, this thing is WannaCry. That peak is WannaCry. So in April 2017, some NSA offensive tools got leaked, and in that leak was an SMB exploit. Those are the Shadow Brokers leaks and Eternal Blue, respectively, for the leak and the name of the exploit. There's a patch already, but there was still plenty of unpatched systems sitting on the internet. That's why we patch. It took about a month for some ne'er-do-well to bundle it up with some automation into a really, really nasty worm. This one could have been a whole lot worse, but it turned out to have a kill switch, actually. So the malware would check to see if a specific domain name was registered before acting. It was a really, really long string of random characters. And a security researcher named Marcus Hutchins figured that out and registered the domain, and then the malware was stopped. A last example here. This is a ransomware gang that started exfiltrating their target's data and threatening to release it so that they could get extra leverage during negotiations whenever they were going back and forth with their target. So if it was a publicly traded company, they threatened to go to news sites and stock exchanges and stock analysts to tank the target stock price, right? They compromise it, they grab a bunch of sensitive data about the business, then they find something that looks bad or makes the company look really bad, and they go around and they threaten to tank the stock price of the company. It's publicly traded, that's really important to them. They stopped operating, at least under this name, a year ago, but their other ransomware operators have already adopted the tactic. So they're optimizing for their own profit margins. If one crew starts doing something that turns out to be really successful, you can bet that everyone else is going to start doing it too. So if you get hit with ransomware today, you should be looking for data exfiltration too, because they're probably going to try to do it. These tactics will continue to evolve at an accelerating pace because the financial incentive to do so is there. If they can do more to get more money, they'll do it. So if moving through an environment manually means that they get a higher payout rate because they can make it more painful for their targets, they'll put the effort in to do that. With a lot of these attacks, the attacker doesn't spend a ton of effort on being stealthy, but if we get better at detecting and responding faster, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that the early stages will get a lot quieter and more stealthy in response. So on the defensive side, we need to expect to keep getting better if we want to have a chance at keeping up. So back to this. The business model works because the attacker makes paying them a dependency for the target to do something that they need to do. Cryptography is a powerful tool for attackers to accomplish this, but there's not really a fundamental reason why it has to be a part of it. If there are other ways that they can make themselves a dependency, they'll probably do so. OT systems, your users' personal data, internal communications, if they can find something that maybe they can threaten to release or to share with somebody who it shouldn't be shared with, and you don't want that to happen enough, they can extort you. Same thing goes for making you look bad with like website defacements or something like that. It's not unreasonable to think that somebody would just try to extort you, would add that on top of other things that they were threatening to do. Whatever it is, if they can use it to make you depend on them in some way, they're going to go after it. And I'm going to pause here to take a breather, get myself a drink of water, and give people a chance to comment or ask more questions. And I'll wait here for a minute. And if there aren't any, we'll just go straight into the what do we do about it part of the talk.
Yeah, and just a reminder, we had that Q&A feature in Zoom. Feel free to drop any questions there. I have a quick question, Ryan. Just in general, we've been seeing more and more with ransomware being almost like a software as a service that you can get. And that's becoming just a huge issue. And gone are the times where, well, not gone, but you may have not so many high value targets, just normal people may be able to buy it and then do like mid targets, like Howard University, for example, was, attacked just recently. So any thoughts on like how we deal with that? And if I'm getting ahead of your presentation, feel free to answer this later if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I do have a couple of thoughts there. That does really relate back to that point about a business model, because these are businesses. And if they can make a profit by selling what they do to other people, then they're going to do so. And if that makes their operations less likely to get found and blown up by three-letter agencies, that's all the better. So I think you can expect that to continue to grow. I also do think that you can expect to see the developers of this get more sophisticated. A lot of the tactics aren't actually that sophisticated. They're kind of smash and grab, but you just see this continuous evolution. And now we're getting to a point where stuff like WannaCry is actually really scary, or could be really, really scary. So that's just a little bit about this, like just selling services, malware development as a service. That's just going to continue. That's not going to stop. As far as what we can do about it, it's malware. I'm going to talk a little bit about stuff that we can do about malware, but not forgetting that at the end of the day, it's malware, and the stuff that you do to protect yourself against malware, it's not really that terribly different if it's ransomware. That's the malware that you're looking to. And I'll get into that more detail in the future.
Great. And it looks like we got a question here. What is the most common user action or attack that is caused by ransomware to initiate?
That is caused by ransom. I'm not sure I'm parsing that question properly. Can you maybe clarify it?
For whoever dropped that question, would you care to elaborate on there?
How do the attacks initiate? It varies a whole lot. If you were talking about the initial attempt, it might just be phishing, it might be drive-by download. As far as what's common, I don't really have a great answer for that, but the standard rules about malware apply. However, you can get that initial compromise. Generally, you just want to do that. If we're talking about what happens first, as in I'm trying to think of a great example there, but I don't think I have one. But regardless, if we're talking about what happens first, there's, like most malware, there's a dropper, and then there's the command and control that is happening, and then there's eventually a series of payloads, depending on what the attacker actually wants to do with what they popped. Does that answer the question? I guess I'm not sure on the initiate part of it. Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, well, if there aren't, I'll go ahead and keep moving. So what do we do about this stuff? So first off, just ask yourself, what's really, really important to you? What would really hurt to lose? Start there, make a list of those things. And once you have that list, start to ask yourself, well, can you actually recover from the loss of any of those? If you can't, start to plan for how to recover from those. If you already can, well, can you make it easier, more reliable, more effective for you to do so in some way? Conversely, can an attacker make it a whole lot more painful for you to do so in some way? Ask yourself how that could happen, how an attacker could deliberately make that happen. And then build these questions into regular tabletop exercises, particularly if we're talking about key assets. Once we're doing that, start actually testing the things that come up in your tabletops. So you're having this discussion about what you would do in a given scenario. Can you actually restore that backup that you said that you could restore from? Can you actually get the data out of your central logging infrastructure as quickly as you said that you could, so that you can respond? Really test your assumptions about your own stuff. Encrypting the files is actually one of the last things that happens. And attackers are doing a ton of stuff before that to lay the groundwork and make your life a lot more painful. Finding out that you're compromised when the file is start encrypting is better than finding out when you get a ransom message, but things are still pretty bad if you find out that. You're going to have to roll incident response regardless. Catching it fast is really important if you want to minimize the damage done. In order to do that, you need logging and alerting. So as you're identifying your key systems, you should be making sure that you're logging and monitoring for them. And you need to configure logging in such a way that you can actually get the information that you would need in order to be able to catch an attacker early. So make sure logging is enabled for at least these types of events, and test it. Also, ship these off to a central logging service for at least your key assets. If a compromise happens, assume that you can't rely on the host logs by themselves. You really need to centralize these because the host logs can readily be deleted by the person who is doing the nasty stuff to your systems. And focus on these events first, but you should expect to continue to build up from here over time. This is really a starting point for doing this properly. If you're noticing a theme here, this is information that you would want to be capturing to detect and respond generally. At the end of the day, just remember, we are talking about malware. Most of what needs to be done for ransomware stuff is stuff you should be doing generally so you can respond to an incident. And your users are a target for attackers looking to establish a foothold somewhere. Helping them do better at security helps you. And EduCause has your back. This page currently emphasizes remote work security resources, which is nice given current events. At the top, there's the top of that page that this link goes to, though, there's another link to the Higher Ed Information Security Council's awareness training program resources. They have a ton of materials for running security awareness programs. Check them out. It's worth a look. And then also, lots of people are interested in security just generally. It's actually an interesting field, at least I think so. And I think that's why a lot of us are in here. Sometimes it's curiosity. Sometimes someone is interested in it for career reasons. Whatever the reason is, I'd be willing to bet that some portion of your users or staff would be interested in going beyond just awareness and training, excuse me, to pick up some more skills. And SANS Cyber Aces is actually a pretty good resource to get them started. And it's free. So you can tell people about it. Your home institution too might already have internal programs or agreements with organizations like SANS that you could take advantage of. Are you getting those simulated phishing emails from your central IT or security organizations, maybe? If so, there might be more resources for you to use than just that. Just have to look around and see. And once you have a starting point, just keep going. I'm referencing Windows examples here because I'm what I'm the most familiar with. And a lot of this guidance is really consistent across Windows systems. There are some really good Linux resources that are related to this as well. You can find them pretty easily by just poking around in these links. Or email me after the talk. Guidance for Linux systems will probably vary more, but again, your professional sysadmins will know the important details for your systems. Windows logging config makes a pretty good example for the kinds of things to log. And the rule with Windows security logging is do what Michael Goff says to do with your logging config. He publishes a set of excellent cheat sheets for handling Windows logs that you can find there under Windows logging cheat sheets. That malware archaeology URL is a really, really powerful resource. Highly recommend going there and looking at those. I've used those for years, and I still to this day do it for the Windows PCs in my own house. Those are a wonderful, wonderful resource. Knowing about the things in the second bullet here can be really, really helpful too, because these are a set of system utilities that are commonly used by red teamers and attackers alike. Just knowing which system binaries to look for can really help you, because these can slide under the radar unless you know to look for them. And the CIS benchmarks, these are just everything under the sun. Well, not everything under the sun, but there are a lot of stuff in here. These are essentially just config guides for adhering to the CIS controls that are tailored to specific systems and software packages. They'll help you get a ton, and even if the CIS controls aren't your control baseline, CIS publishes some pretty good mappings to other control sets, so you can do the work to crosswalk that yourself and still use the benchmarks. This is my favorite resource by far for system hardening when I am not sure where exactly to start with a particular piece of software or a particular system. It's the first place that I'm going to go look if I don't know where to start. This stuff is kind of in that category of things that seem pretty scary and in some situations really are pretty scary to implement. But in a lot of cases, they're nowhere near as scary as they seem. Setting application control things up properly can really be a bear, but if the system actually has a well-defined workflow that rarely changes, this is pretty manageable. You do need someone to manage it though, and you really can't do it everywhere, but it is a big win when it's configured properly. And just to emphasize, don't try to do this everywhere at the same time. It will overwhelm you. Take small bites and really focus on your key assets. If nothing else, the logs for these are a really good resource for incident response. So knowing that a new unsigned PowerShell script ran from a user-owned directory, or that a specific process did something unusual, can be really, really useful. Your backup servers are a great example, I think. They probably end up doing a whole lot of the same kind of thing. Their software workflows probably don't change a lot, so that might be a pretty good place to look if you're looking to apply this to control ransomware. If you're curious about AppLocker configuration, reach out to me after the talk. I can point you at some good guides and probably talk your ear off way more than you want about all the different pitfalls that you'll run into when configuring AppLocker. And now we're getting into the specifics for ransomware. Backups are important. Like, it doesn't matter if we're talking about ransomware or not, backups are important. This just makes it a whole lot more salient. The first two items here are kind of basics. Really carefully consider your permissions for your backup systems. First, the system being backed up, what processes and accounts can actually do things with backups? Are there things that are that have privileges or have access to backups that just don't need it? Start to lock that stuff down. On your backup systems themselves, every system probably doesn't need the capability to write over every other system's backups. So if you're doing automated backups, maybe constrain the conditions around when that happens. Now, can you limit it at all? There's a decent chance that you can also set up versioning such that old versions can't be deleted without some sort of intervention. Or maybe you'll be able to do things like limit the number of versions that can be created in a particular time period. Just consider what you can do to set up constraints that around your backups that would help you out in the event that something tries to go delete all your backups or delete all the versions of your backups where the malware hadn't encrypted something. Start treating the capability to overwrite and delete backups as if it were privileged access, regardless of what the platform is. Just adhere to least privilege on this. It's keep the basics straight. And this final bullet kind of deserves its own slide. It can be helpful to build out the capability to take certain things offline as soon as you see a problem. If your network team can make some of this happen, it could be a huge win for minimizing the damage. You kind of want two options here. First, cut it off from the network. If you're worried that you're going to lose something valuable in system memory, at least be able to isolate it from anything else. And second, take it completely offline. If you're worried that a backup server might already be compromised and it's encrypting files, you probably just want to kill it right away. Just offline the thing. You're going to lose some forensic artifacts from memory, but keeping your backups intact is almost always more important than that. Same rules exist for network shares, but for an extra reason. Attackers sometimes use these for lateral movement and for getting their own stuff around or for exfiltrating data. So build out the capability, consider those when you're considering that for your backups as well. And then cloud storage and sync services, you might want to be able to prevent communications to these. So do a bit of digging and find out what these services connect to on what ports, and set up some rules that that can enable you to block it all. It's not just stopping the malware in your environment from encrypting data and deleting versions on these services, but you're also trying to stop attackers from exfiltrating data to these. And this is an avenue that they would use. You want to have the ability to block stuff like Mega as well as Box or Google Drive. Don't just focus on the stuff that is approved in your own environment, because the attackers may not use And when it comes to ransomware, one of the most powerful features of VM environments is the ability to pause them, or whatever else your particular VM infrastructure calls this. Basically, the ability to retain the memory contents while still stopping the machine. That is the capability that you want, because that both stops the ransomware from encrypting more files and also retains forensic artifacts for response. So consider whether you can quickly pause a whole bunch of VMs if you have an incident. Plan to keep getting better. Attackers are going to keep getting better. We've already talked about the business model and the financial incentives. They're going to get better, and we need to as well. So it's build it into your normal activities, or we won't actually get ahead. Your hot wash, postmortem, after action report, or whatever other military jargon term you want to use to describe that learning exercise after you complete an exercise or simulation of some type for security, that exercise should be helping you to plan improvements. And if it's not, you're missing a big opportunity there. Another one, threat intel sources. You want to know not just what attackers were doing when an incident responder gave that one talk at DEF CON, but you really want to know what attackers are doing now. So there are a lot of sources out there. RenISAC is an awesome thing. They're a bunch of awesome people too, so go talk to them. Same thing with Stinger or other honeypot things like that. These things can give you a view of what attackers are doing presently or in the very recent history, instead of what they were doing months and months and months ago. You should really be staying up to date so you can look for current activity or try to block based on current activity. Or at least having somebody else do it for you. This is somewhere where Research.Doc and OmniSoc might be able to help out, for example. And welcome to our dystopian present. It's my personal opinion that paying ransoms is short-sighted. That is a personal opinion. However, the reality is that it might make the most sense to pay sometimes. I don't like it, but that might be the case. You have to make that decision for yourself. If you have to pay, there are some things that you might want to keep in mind. So ask yourself, if you needed to put a large sum of money into cryptocurrency in a few days, could you actually do it? Where's that threshold where you start running into transaction limits? Is that in scope of what attackers might reasonably demand and still expect to get paid by you? If you need to get a large sum of money into cryptocurrency quickly, it can actually help to have an established account with a cryptocurrency exchange. That's up to you and your financial department. But this is something that that people in the corporate world have actually started to do. I'm not a lawyer, and as far as I know, this isn't set in any kind of stone. This is definitely still being figured out. But being able to say the phrase, or being able to ask yourself, am I materially supporting a sanctioned entity, is a scary question to be able to ask. That sounds like really bad news bears. So talk to your legal counsel. Make sure that they know what's happening, what it is that you're worried about, and make sure that you can pay a ransom without running afoul of the law in some unexpected way. And then also, if you think your insurance covers this, talk to them. Be open, be honest, and make sure you didn't do anything that would cause them to deny a claim, or that you don't do anything to cause them to deny a claim. And the title of the slide isn't a joke. I wish it was, but it's actually a real thing. Ransomware negotiator is on people's business cards. The attackers you're negotiating with about the ransom are people who do this all the time. And they are far, far, far more experienced and better at it than any of us are on the defensive side. At least consider hiring a negotiator if you're thinking of paying a ransom. You don't have to, but that is somebody who is a professional at this, and they will know what the attackers are going to try and do. That's all the material that I really had prepped. And it looks like we've still got about 20 minutes left for questions. But first off, if you have any questions about this that you don't want to just put in the chat here, or you want to discuss ransomware or controls to prevent ransomware from really causing you problems, feel free to reach out to me directly. You can also reach ResearchSoc at rsoc@iu.edu and CACR, my home center, at cacr@iu.edu. So thank you very much. And this brings us to the discussion and Q&A part of this.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, and like we said earlier, feel free to use that Q&A feature. We had a couple comments, I think, in here that you may be able to touch on.
Yeah, yeah. First one, Michael Davis. Yes, immutable backups. If you can make your backups immutable, that is that it is written once and then it doesn't get touched again. That is awesome. MFA, that is probably something that I should have had in the slides somewhere if I didn't. I meant to when I was prepping this, and I must have cut it out and not put it back in somewhere else. But yes, multi-factor off for actions such as deleting backups. So that there's two things there. There's the multi-factor off for specific actions, which is very, very powerful. And there's just the general put multi-factor onto your accounts, please, please. That's a very, very powerful security control. And then I see Department of Treasury has just issued an advisory on potential sanctions risk. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of scary. I'm not sure what to think of it at this point. I think we'll see what happens. My hope is that that ends up leading to enough people not paying ransoms that ransomware ends up in a decline. My worry is that it ends up making the situation much worse because people end up still paying the ransoms and just not talking about it. Yeah, I really don't know where this is going to go, but it's a real risk. And that's why I'd say you should probably talk to your legal counsel if you're thinking about paying a ransom now. Ransomware negotiators. I don't know the answer to that question. What credentials should the person have? I am not a professional negotiator at all. You can probably tell by me stumbling over myself with the ums and the ahs when I was giving a presentation, but I'm not the most qualified in general in that kind of way. So I don't really have a great idea there. I'm sorry, I can't be of more help. You might look to see if they have evidence of other negotiations that they've been successful at. That would probably be where I'd start. Insurance companies have risks, maybe, yeah. I think that of anyone, cyber insurance companies probably have one of the strongest financial incentives to get this stuff really, really right. So that's probably a good place to start looking. We've got Q&A and chat. Okay, yeah. Any other questions?
As people think of any more on there about going back to cyber insurance, it is a really interesting complex, I feel like, because we obviously, the more companies pay for ransom, the more leverage, I guess, success keeping ransomware around, like thinking the overall goal. And then even for cyber insurance, I know there's some point where they may prefer you to pay the ransom, and then it gets into that kind of, ethical dilemma, which is obviously very relevant whether you do or not. And not that that's a question to answer here or anything, but it is just an interesting complex to have, that sometimes that insurance companies would want you to pay for it, even though that may not be what we want to do long term for ransomware and how we deal with it in the future.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's ever changing. Yeah, this is an evolving area. Will the slides be made available? Yes, they will. I think they're going up on the ResearchSoc webinars websites. Corey, do you have a link for that?
Yeah, I can grab one. We have a training section webpage, and you can see all our past webinars, and we usually get that up shortly after today, within maybe a week or so.